Hello and welcome to this evening's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith featuring Kate Elliott for her new novella, Servant Mage, speaking with us, and S.A. Chakraborty. My name is Alex Schafter, and I'm the events director at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Massachusetts. You may be familiar with our store. I think some of you before, in which case, welcome back. It's wonderful to have you as part of our event audience again. If this is the first time you've ever heard of us, welcome. It's wonderful to have you as part of our community for the first time. And I kind of like the chorus, some schnauzer power in the background. In any case, we are really happy to have you here tonight, and we appreciate the support that all of you show of Kate Elliott's wonderful writing and of an independent bookstore through your purchases and your attendance. Being able to sell books to you through these events is what lets us keep doing them. So if you haven't already bought a book, please feel free to do so. I will drop that link for you even now.
This is going to be a much interrupted show, so enjoy.
Sorry.
No, we already, I can already see how this is going to go.
Yeah. We're going to have fun here. Many thanks to Shannon Chakraborty, who's here in conversation. She's the author of the Devabad trilogy and has visited us many times in person and online. It is lovely to have you back. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And now,
thank you. Yeah, thank you, Shannon.
It is very exciting to welcome, at least for the first time for me, a veteran author of genre fiction, Kate Elliott. Kate has written for over 30 years for books including the Spirit Walker series, Unconquerable Sun, which is a gender-swapped Alexander the Great in space. So you're missing out if you haven't read that. The Crossroads series, the Crown of Stars series, and the YA fantasy Court of Fives in its follow-up. Her books whip up all the drama and intrigue of classic fantasy and frequently place women at the center of the action. In Servant Mage, a young indentured servant becomes integral to a plot that could shake society across a continent, and she sees, for the first time in years, a chance to reclaim herself and her home. And I really want to get right into it, so that's it. Thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you
Kate.
so much. Thank you. And thanks to Shan for agreeing to do this.
Oh, no, I'm excited to do this.
So today is actually the day before publication. Are you excited for release day tomorrow?
You know, this is an interesting question, and I knew you were going to ask it. And I have been writing for so long, like, you know, back when we were carving in stone, that it's weird because I've written 2 books since this got turned into production. And I'm like, oh, that book. Oh, what had happened in that? Right. So yeah, I'm always thrilled when a book comes out because it's like, oh, here's another one. But it also feels like it was 10 years ago, right, that I last saw it. So the whole production schedule, and not to mention pandemic, is so bizarre now. So yes, I'm thrilled that people will have a chance to read this book, which means a lot to me for a couple of different reasons, some personal and some because of things I was doing as a writer. And I've written long enough that now I can I try to take on challenges to do something I didn't do before. And someone is laughing now in the audience. I see you. And I just wanted to write a complete story at 40,000 words. And I did succeed. So that was the challenge, one of the challenges for this book. So I'm excited for people to see it.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that's really interesting about this book, right, is that it really operates on an epic scale. It's talking about these massive political forces, sometimes multi-world forces, and you're fitting all of that into such a condensed space. What led you to the novella as a place for an idea this big to live?
Well, I always try to start with a short story idea. And I figure if I have a short story idea, which is like this one young woman's small journey where she realizes something about herself and where she came from and how that gives her strength. I mean, that's the whole story right there. You actually summed it up really well. So if I start with that idea, then maybe I can fit it into a novella. And so it is a lot of material. But
it's a lot of material.
But if I had been writing it as a novel, it just would be so different. Because the focus is it's so on her, and there's so few other characters. For me, she deals with mostly with four other characters, and then a few other people who come in at different, and that's a tiny cast for me. And actually Shan knows exactly all about this, right?
Oh yeah.
Right? Like how many people
Yes.
are you fit? And then as you add people,
Yes.
I
think I am in awe of people who can write short stories and novellas. Just in awe. I mean, I love to read them. I cannot wrap my mind around writing that small. I did for the next book I'm working on. I was determined to stick to 400 pages, and I did get that. And I was impressed with myself that I got it to 4. Yeah, the last book was like 800. So I wanted to do something smaller. And it's interesting what you say about the characters, because of course one of the easiest, most functional ways to do that was to have only one voice, and to have it so much more centered on this person, that even though the book itself is very much a found family and you meet all of these different people, you are seeing it from this one close person perspective. And I just felt like it was a different kind of story as well. I tend to think, people are always like, oh, do you aim for a certain word count or page limit? And you kind of need to, this story is going to need the space it needs. I think there are some stories that give themselves more necessarily to epics. There are some stories that are simply short stories. But I think it's hard before you really know what that tale is going to be to necessarily know how long it's going to be.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I set myself the goal to write this as a novella. It did mean that there were moments where I said, well, I should, and then I would go, no, I can't. I have to keep it. And in that sense, it was, I don't want to say it was a writing exercise, because that sounds so dry, right? And it sounds like I was not writing the story of Felion, whose story I wanted to tell, and the story of this aftermath of this violent revolution that hasn't really, even after 30 years, ended yet. And what all the repercussions, because that's a story I really wanted to tell. But at the same time, I feel like as a writer, I can also say, this is what I want to try to do with this. I want to push myself. So and there was always that push-pull going on with it. Can I introduce another character? Can I give this character a name? Oh, I have to give them a name because it won't work if I don't. But then I need to make sure it doesn't expand too much. And I have to tell you, when the final draft was done, after the editorial comments were in, and I did a final draft and I looked at it, it was like 40,211 words, something like that. And I said, no, I'm not doing this. And so I went through and like literally line edited, like I'm taking out 2 words here, taking out 1 word here. And I went through the whole thing and got it down below 40,000 words, just so I could say, this is a real novella by whatever the SIFWA standard is, right? I just had to do it.
I have to ask though, because you're such a good world builder, did you finish this and were you just like, I want to go back to this world and tell more stories? I mean, is that the next thing of like, you limited it, now it's getting published, but do you feel that itch to return?
Well, so here's the thing. I promised to tell people something they didn't know. The truth is that this is not the first story I started telling in this world. There is already a story which starts from a completely different angle. There's a hint dropped. Big, it's more than a hint later in the story that there's something exists that most people don't know about that will make a difference for the other side, the losing side, right? And it starts from that angle in a totally different place. And I had started working on that story 10 years ago. And then I put it I know. And then I put it aside. And in 2018, 2019, I needed something to work on that wasn't, for various reasons, that was something I just wanted to work on. And I decided to tell a story in this world that went over some of these things that I'm really concerned about. What happens to the little people in these revolutions? What happens to them? How do they survive? What if magic was something people wanted to use and not to celebrate, but to you, and that's the title, Servant Mage, right? But at the same time, I was like, plus I can teach myself a lot about this world by telling this story in it and keeping it contained.
That's a tremendous way to do world building, isn't it? It's like you have the center voice, the center person that you really want to know about, and then you have to understand how that person came about by looking around them from their perspective, and so much world sort of fills out from there. And I see that a lot in Servant Mage. I think one of the things that I enjoyed most about it was some of the fine detail. So that was actually something I wanted to ask about, was how both of you come across not the big world building stuff, but the tiny details, like the plant that she uses to mask the spell of not being able to bathe all the time, or the specific cloths that people use to dress, the foods and the styles. How do you get to those granular details that really build a world into a place that you can inhabit as a reader?
I think that it is these little details of daily life that just thrown in, you know, that you take the shoes off before you go into the house. That would be like a Hawaii thing, right? That just thrown in as something as people move. To me, these ground the world in a way that other things, me telling you about it as the writer, don't. So I'm always looking for the little things. When I wrote Crown of Stars, which is 7 volumes, 7 really big volumes, and it's literally a world-shattering epic story. One of the things I did at that time was I would give you 3 details when now I would use 1. And so that's why I've kind of gone more granular with details. Like, what is this detail? It gives me a sense of ordinary life that tells me something about the world. And it also tells me something I need to know something more about this character or this setting or this event. That's why it's focused on there. So I'd be interested to hear, Shan, how you do it.
I feel very much the same way. I like my scenes to engage all of the senses. So you walk into something and it's not just you're describing visually, it's what does it smell like, what are the sounds in the air, what is the feel of, you know, is it hot, is it cold, what's the feel on your skin, but also to make sure all of those details serve the world building. So say, you know, a scene in one of my books, you walk into essentially the main palace in Daevabad and you have the descriptions. You can invent all sorts of beautiful details, but they should work. So we've already known in the story that this palace has been stolen over generations. So you see the history in the walls, the remnants of the old order is there. How are people arranged up on the steps? You know, what does it matter what they're wearing? What does that say about their status? What they're drinking? Why is one person drinking wine? One person is drinking tea. And you have an idea, the crowd, how does the crowd move? Does, you know, the tyrant in power yells and everybody cringes back? So you're walking the reader essentially through this scene. And I believe in, you know, I love my details and my descriptions, but I very much think they should all serve the plot, because that's your world building right there. You don't have to have the info dump of, oh, these people had, you know, displaced one. If a character looks up and thinks, hey, that's, you know, those things that they've carved into the walls, that's not the language they speak here anymore. You know, it kind of furthers the idea of the world without you actually having to, you know, say this is why they have that.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. Yeah.
I think what Kate said about having one object or one description where she'd previously have 3 is really insightful, because I think what both of you are saying is that a single object can sort of cast into relief the entire world that could create that object.
I think it's also interesting.
Go on. I'll be back.
Why she has to do that. Yes. You know, it's kind of, how do you choose that one detail? Like, I work a lot with historical fantasy, especially for my next project. And when people always ask me, you know, what details do you pick? Find something that's unique. You know, we all work in fantasy. We have the tropes of the stews of bread and larder and all that. But did they use barley? Would they have been drinking beer instead of the fancy wine? Like, I think if you can find something unusual and unique, that's the detail to seize on, rather than just describing for the 50th time in the book that everyone's wearing silk or something. You know, like, find something that's more unique than that, that I think makes it stand out.
Yeah, and the other thing that I like to do is think about what different characters, you can have two different characters come into a room and they're each going to notice something different. You know, and it was interesting for me to write Cold Magic, the Spirit Walker trilogy, because the main character sews. And so I don't sew, right? But she's always focused on what people are wearing and does something need to be mended. And, oh, look at that. I like that, you know, and so that meant that I started looking at the world differently too. So it also affects how I approach the world, because there were things she wouldn't notice that one of my other characters would have noticed, but they weren't the focus. They weren't it wasn't their perspective.
Absolutely.
One thing we were talking about before we got going was obviously, not surprisingly, in a panel of fantasy authors, magic and how you arrive at the different kinds of magic you use. Because I think both of you at this point have approached that in a couple of different ways. So I'd love to hear, where does magic start for you when you're walking into a new world?
Do you want to start, Shan?
I can try. I'm just thinking, I've had a very different history with this, because I wrote my first book, the Daevabad trilogy, which is very much set. It's almost a little bit of a portal fantasy. We have our human thief who's taken into the world of Jinn, which exists along our own side world. And then the trilogy I'm working on right now, it's set in that same world. It's in our world, but it's from the human side. So it's kind of, you start with, and a lot of it was, just building up of, we start and it just seems like history. There's just tantalizing parts like, is this real? Is this not real? So it's, I think you do what you need to for the world. Whereas, magic was an integral part of the Daevabad trilogy. It was something in all their lives. Now it's in my new work. It's something that's feared. It's something that's unknown. It's, and it's been fun to play with those expectations, because it very much feels like, I just kind of crossed over the other side, that we're dealing with the same world, but now it's through the other set of eyes on the other side of the mirror, I guess.
I'm so excited for this.
I would like to hear more.
So excited for it. Servant Mage was actually me kind of thinking, one of the things about writing at all in the science fiction fantasy genre, and then especially over a long period of time, I think, is that we're kind of always in conversation with the genre and what came before. That's how I work. And then also with ourselves, what did I do before? And what do I think about that? So, and I really, to me, magic exists in so many interesting ways in fantasy. So you have magic. I wrote down some, these are just some examples. Magic can be an essence that's in the land. It can be an essence that's in people. I think of the Daevabad a little bit like that. Jinn have magic there. It's in their bones and flesh and blood, right? It's just part of who they are. It's part of their essence. You can have bloodline magic. You can have birthright magic. You can have chosen one magic. You can have, I guess what I'll call access magic, in which some people are allowed to learn the things they need and other people are never allowed. You can have kind of skilled, gifted magic. Some people have more of a gift than others, and so they're more likely to get it. And I wanted specifically to think about a magic system in which many people have access to it, but many never get the training. And that you can talk all you want about merit. And the novella deliberately addresses this and confronts it. You can talk about merit all you want, but if people don't have a chance to learn, they can't get farther than, being what they say in the roughs. A rough is someone who has an ability to access magic, but has no training and often no ability to train. And so I wanted to deliberately talk about that, about what access means and who's allowed to learn and who's allowed to become skilled. And then how those skills are used by the people in power who might have the ability to manipulate, right? How much people can learn and who's allowed to do what. And that to me is like, that the whole magic system comes out of that, my wanting to look at that.
Well, that's really interesting, because it's not just about having any access to using the magic at all. I think one thing that's interesting about the way you use magic in Servant Mage is that there's a degree to which people in power want the powerless to understand, and that is the limit at which they wish people to understand. So like your main character knows how to do a few things, and people want her to know that so that they can use it, but they don't want her to know any more than that. And I think that's really unusual and interesting in a dreadful kind of way.
Well, my dad was an educator. He taught American history, and then later in his career, he was an administrator at community college. So he was the dean of instruction at a community college, and of course, and he often talked about how is history taught. What do we learn? What are we allowed to learn? What's left out? And that totally influenced this story. His experience, and he didn't have a high opinion of how well history was taught in the United States.
Agreed.
Yeah, exactly.
Much to the chagrin of many teachers.
Yeah.
So I'd like to talk about perspective a little bit. Once upon a time, somebody told me that they almost always like writing from the perspective of the person who least knows what's going on, because you get a lot of fun from the person who's trying to keep up at the same time that the reader is. And I wondered, I think that kind of I think that's kind of true in Servant Mage, but in general, do you feel like you prefer characters who know what's going on, or do you like writing from the perspective of people who are scrambling?
Yes. I mean, I've written enough now that I can do both, and I find it interesting to do both, or actually multiples, right? Because there's so many angles. I have a horror of repeating myself, even though I know to some extent as a writer, we have like thematic interests and ways of looking at the world that are going to show up again and again. It's interesting in the Devabet trilogy, because you get both of those in one story, right? In the first
and
book,
that was intentional.
That
was absolutely intentional, because I like doing both. The idea of writing somebody who's new to the world is an incredibly often convenient device for us as writers, because we can just introduce you to the world, and it's not info dumping if the character's learning it at the same time. I do think sometimes when you have, I very much like to examine systems of power and corruption and, systemic inequality. And I think sometimes that's easier from a character who's in on the system. But with my first book, The City of Brass, I very much wanted to have both, because getting back to that idea about not teaching history correctly, the central conflict of that is whose history is right, who are you, a war criminal, or are you a hero? And I wanted to have not just somebody who was new to this world and somebody who was embedded in this world, but to have those different perspectives, because I think it's a great way to amp up tension to the point when these two, the reader is going, oh, this is not going to be good. They have very different clashing perspectives of this. So I think that's another way to amp up tension, and kind of also examine the different ways of, whose narrative is correct, whose narrative is unreliable, and kind of play with the idea of reader expectations there.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, in Servant Mage, I had already made the decision that I wanted to tell from the point of view of someone who is just trying to survive, and has been torn. She lost the people she loved the most in the world. She's been torn from her home, and all she has is the memory of, the knowledge of that love and those principles that she has to help her survive in a pretty hostile situation. And I wanted her to be in that hostile situation so that then I could examine power. Here we are, the two of us. I love talking about power, because we all live it every day, and we all try to understand it every day. And so you see her trying to understand how power functions in this world. And so she had to be there. Yeah. She had to be there. But I also, as Shan says, it's a great, starting with someone who doesn't know anything and has to learn is a fascinating way to It's a great mechanism to help the reader, because then they can be that person. Or like with the Sun books, I had to have Sun as a point of view character, and she's right in the middle of it, and all her expectations about how she thinks the world is as this, she's in the center of the power. That can be tricky, but it also gives a perspective that you don't get any other way. So I love writing. Isn't it the best?
It is.
It's so cool.
It's so much fun.
Well, and when you're talking about a character who really does know what's going on, I think a lot of the fun comes from the moments where they flub, right? Where they are the mastermind and they do understand and they're clear-sighted, but something trips them up. And those moments where they're sort of hurtling through the air become some of the most exciting moments in the book. So yeah, I guess the long and short of that is that even if they mostly know what's going on, sometimes it's nice when they stop knowing what's going on.
Or they have to run up against something they didn't know, right? Or that maybe their way of looking at the world is incomplete.
Yeah.
And that's hard. And some people will turn away from that. They'll say, no, I can't believe that. And other people will be shocked and then try to change something. So there's so many great places where you can have drama or melodrama or whatever drama.
You're talking about all the different kinds of fantasy, all kinds of magic earlier. And I'm wondering if either of you have sort of like seminal works that you think of when you think this is somebody who really understood how you can make magic work for a book. Because I know there are authors that I think of where I'm like, I don't really know how you did that, but it has changed my thinking. And I wondered if either of you have writers like that.
I have to say, I feel so old school saying this. I really became a writer in large part because I read Lord of the Rings. I was writing little things before that, but that kind of like my whole perspective of what you could do kind of got, I can't explain it. It was like a seismic shift. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this history and this idea of history and ages, and then the way magic is present and yet hard to reach, and everything about it. And plus long journeys. I'm like totally into long journeys. It had it all. It had it all. Plus my first book crush, Glorfindel. So what can I say? So I would say that I don't think I'm at all a Tolkien-esque writer now, or not. I don't think I ever was, but that really is kind of a foundational work for me.
I mean, I always think it's nice if a foundational book and the book that you end up writing are not the same, because it means that something changed in you because of that book, but you didn't stick at the point of trying to replicate it.
Well, I'm not actually interested in trying. It's fun. Sometimes people ask, was there a book you wanted that you wish you had written? But there isn't a book that someone else wrote that I wish I had written. Right. I'm glad they wrote it, right? Because I couldn't have written it. I couldn't have done what Tolkien did. I'm not an Oxford Don with intense years of study of obscure languages. I couldn't create languages the way he did because I don't have the skills. So there's something about trying to capture a feeling or an aesthetic or a moment to me, that's more what, I guess the way in which that was foundational. And this idea about history and how history rings down, the repercussions ring down through what happens in the modern world of the story. But I want to hear, Shan, what are your influences?
I'm trying because I thought instantly of 10 different authors, and now I'm cycling through who would be an interesting person to speak about. In terms of fantasy, I am somewhat of a latecomer to fantasy. I was very much into history and science fiction, and honestly, M.K. Jemisin. I remember I was just toying around with my little history fanfic books when I first read her first trilogy, The Inheritance Cycle, and I just remember just being in awe of how she wrote, essentially these are deity figures and they're so messed up. And it was, it very much felt like what I loved about mythology, the mythological gods and all that, but brought to this modern audience. And I really enjoyed the different ways she talked about power and this idea of enslaving these gods. And just there was just a wild out there-ness to how they could be. It was they were so inhuman and yet human. And it was just, it made me think about writing and that kind of aspects differently. And then even again, essentially with all of her books, I mean, even just I'm a New Yorker, and The City We Became, I was just, I was like, I never thought about that. And like, even just giving different personalities that represented the boroughs, it was just fascinating. And I like reading books that, again, like you're saying, that I wouldn't have written this. I don't want to have written this. It just inspires you to think about putting stories together and looking at all different ways, in just ways you wouldn't have imagined beforehand.
Yeah, it's almost like a story like that. And City We Became is so fabulous. And also, and let's not forget the tentacle porn in 100,000 Kingdoms. Always important to mention that. Because I remember reading and going, whoa, what, you're going there? Oh, you're going there.
I think anyway. I'm not going to lie. I think I missed that.
Oh,
I'm like, what did I not? I read that book a few times. Like, I don't know. I was very straight-laced at 20, but I'll have to check it out again.
Do. Read between the lines, so to speak. Yeah. But I think one thing that happens with me with books like that I just really feel it's like, I think they make all of us bigger. Right. And then all of us say, hey, I'm going to dig deeper and find more of myself to put into my work. I'm going to become more of myself. That's my goal always in my work.
Yeah.
I think that's a really lovely way of thinking of it. Because I think sometimes the fantasy can so often be about these huge ideas, and about sort of world changing, world breaking, vast, countrysides and conflicts and so on. But I think when you say Tolkien, for example, I think what is really crucial about that book, and one of the reasons that it, has become what it is that there are these deep roots in mythology, but what's bringing us through that story are like simple people on their own 2 feet. And when you put that really deep personhood into the center of those deep mythologies, that's what becomes compelling. So I really like the idea of fantasy as something that you can truly put selfhood into.
That's really well said. That's really well said. It's always this contrast. You're looking for that contrast, whatever it might be. And that's such a contrast. Frodo and everything, right? Poor Frodo at the end,
We've already got a few questions, and we have about 20 minutes to go. So we can pop in and out of those. If you have questions and haven't asked them yet, feel free to, but I'm going to go ahead and grab a couple of them. Let's see. We have one from Susan who says, how often do you find you start a story or book and then realize you actually need to stray over here or there and write another book in the story first?
I'm sure there's an example. Oh, actually, there's a great example. So I started writing this was back 15 years ago or so. I started writing the prologue to a book, and then the prologue got to be 40 pages, and then it got to be 70 pages, and then it got to be 90 pages. And I was like, and then a friend of mine said, maybe you just need to write that as a novel first. And that novel turned into the Crossroads trilogy. So the Crossroads trilogy is the prologue. It's a standalone trilogy. This is the one that starts with Spirit Gate. It's a standalone trilogy. It's complete in of itself, but it tells the story I was trying to tell in a 20-page prologue. So, and then so that's, yes, that happened. That does happen to me sometimes. Sometimes I start absolutely on and I go and I'm fine. I never look back, but not always.
I feel like it took me 10 years to write my first book. And that was because I mostly didn't think I was writing a book that anybody would ever read. And it was just going back and forth. And I had like 12 different point of view characters at a certain point. And it was, you're just kind of playing around and seeing, who works and what sparks joy. I think that's normal. I mean, I I'm sure there are some writers out there who are much better at plotting things out and can kind of figure this out. But even with my latest book, it took me a full year of just messing around with things to see at what point I was even entering, my main character's life. I'm writing from the perspective of, a retired pirate. And, it was kind of like, okay, are we doing multiple like linear narratives here? Are we seeing flashbacks from when she was younger and how she became a pirate? Are we just doing the current one? And you have to kind of play around with things, I think. And yeah, that takes you sometimes and being like, I think this is a different book. I think I'll write this one before, I'll write this one after, but it's just kind of following that storyline.
Yeah, and I do a lot of that. I always have, I like to call it, I always have my side chick, right? If I am working on my contracted book, but I always have one or two things that are over here on the side that I'm working on. So for example, last year I wrote about 20,000 words starting a story, and then I kind of realized I had hit a conceptual wall. And so a friend of mine kindly read it, and we talked about it, and I realized that, okay, I got past the conceptual wall, but that meant that while the first chapter still worked, I had to change the second chapter. So I have set it aside, and it's going to sit for a while. So meanwhile, I'm started something else, so kind of a larger, possibly multi-volume epic fantasy work, and I've written about, I don't know, 7,000 or 8,000 of that. And at some point I'm going to put it aside because I need to go back to work on specifically. I'm in the editing. I'm revising right now, but I'll have to go back to first drafting on something else, right? That's contracted. So, but those will kind of collect, and it could take a couple of years for those things. And then they change as they go over time until finally I settle on whatever it is that I was going with. Servant Mage was a little different because I knew the framework had to be so tight that I made a slight change to the beginning. I moved it back like 20 minutes from where I originally started it. It originally starts with Shay walking into this thing, and then I thought I'd have to explain too much, so I went back and wrote that at the opening scene because that presents everything I needed. But that's the only change I really made to that. So it just depends on the story.
Let's see. That made me think of something. No, I've forgotten what it is. So if I remember, I'll ask about it. In the meantime, Rachel asks, does Servant Mage exist anywhere in the expanded Kate Elliott universe, like some of your other books and series do?
No. No.
Sound like you maybe yes, but it's a spoiler. I'm sorry, was that a call out?
No. It's not related to Crossroads. Let's just put it that way. And it's not related to Crown of Stars, and it's not related to Spirit Walker. So not to any of the published worlds, but I don't want to say more. Maybe months
harkening
after,
back to that question about there's something else that is hinted at in the book.
Yeah. Maybe in a year I might mention something more. So
we'll take that for what it's worth. Hold it close to our hearts. Let's see. Zainab says, how do you juggle between what you as the author know about the plot setting and character backstory and how much the reader knows about those things yet or ever when you're trying to figure out a particular scene or chapter and what it's meant to convey?
Shannon, have you figured out how to do this yet? Because I sure still am struggling with it.
No, my solution is mostly to completely overwrite. Just pages and pages and pages and pages of backstory and history and characters who will never ever be seen in published form. And then to pick and choose what is important. I wish I had a better answer for that. I think, pantser, gardener, whatever you want to call it. I very much like to have stories flow organically, and sometimes they've got to flow in places no one will ever see. I mean, I will often write out scenes from another character's perspective for a scene that's going to be, from somebody else's, just to know how they would respond, because it just comes to me more when I'm writing it. Yes, it's terrible. I hate it. It takes me so long to write a book, but so it's kind of like by the time it's getting to the reader's eyes, like it does feel like then I can more shape the narrative because I know what you need to know, even if there's so much more. So, which is not a good answer or in any way an effective way of working.
I just love that.
It's
Your
a fun
finished books are
answer.
like this big, but the secret is that they're this
They
big.
started, yeah. No, it's
Yeah.
a fine answer because, like, what do? We just have to work on our process. We
Yeah.
don't even know how our process is going to work. I'm still working on this. It's just like a constant challenge because I know everything except for the things I don't know, which I often don't figure out until it's too late, right? But theoretically, I know everything. I have this picture in my head, but transferring that to the page is just so, that's art, right? That's the art. The people need to, if they can even get a sliver of what I'm seeing, then I've succeeded. But it's so easy for me to put something in and think it's clear to them, but it isn't, and it needed more, or to put too much in because I'm afraid they're going to miss it, and it was too much. So it's just, I'm still working on it. That's my answer. I'm still working on it. I think I'm better at it than I used to be, but I still find myself running up against, say a reader saying, "Oh, I didn't get what this was," or, whatever. And I think, "Oh, I should have explained that more, but it didn't occur to me I needed to." Because
even on that, I think this was a shock for me when I first published my first book is interpretation. You can put out what you're out there, but everyone is going to have a different read on it and a different interpretation on it.
Yeah.
And that is both terrifying and sort of exhilarating, because has been, as a writer, it can be terrifying because people will read that and they'll be like, "How dare you not be clear about that? You're saying this," when you're like, I didn't say that. But as a creative, that is actually like rather exhilarating and amazing to realize is just, what a way to just really make that this is art and that this is so flexible and subjective, to just see everyone's different reactions to something that you've created.
Yeah, I think Ken Liu, I'm paraphrasing Ken Liu, who said like the art happens in that where those two places meet. And isn't that amazing?
Yes.
Happens at that border.
Yeah.
It just blows me away.
Well, and I think something that didn't come up is, there's the line of things that that the character can't. And it isn't always easy to toe that line as the writer. But that is where readers come in, like crit groups and editors and friends.
Yes.
You can say like, I don't know anything about this except exactly what you put in front of me. And this is what happens when you walk into that room cold. So not underestimating the power of community
yes.
in that question.
If one can get good, astute, generous, but also honest beta readers, or whatever you want to call them, people to read early, they are a gift because they will say, "I didn't understand this." And you thought it was really obvious. I just used this example yesterday when I did the Narrative Worlds with Karen Lord, but I just published on Tor.com one of the short stories. It's kind of a retelling of the Hans Christian Andersen story, The Tinderbox, and two friends of mine read it. Neither of them, I didn't know this when I sent it to an earlier version to them, that neither of them had read The Tinderbox. So they were like, "Well, why with this?" And I realized that I had to kind of shoehorn more of the original story in, not to retell it, but not to like say this happened and then that happened, but to hint at it so that you could understand the context of the rest. Because I grew up with that story. I'm Danish American, and that's so ingrained in my bones that even though I knew theoretically that not everybody knows that story by heart like I do, it didn't come out in that early draft of the story. So it's so useful to have people who can say, "I don't understand what's going on here."
Yes.
And then you can go, "Oh, okay, I need to think about how I'm doing that."
Yes. I think I go through different perspectives with beta readers. My first beta reader is actually my husband, which I tell people and they're like, "How?" But he's a fantasy reader and he's not a writer, but he's very good. He is oftentimes more blunt than my actual writer beta, my professional writer friends will be, but it's good. Like, I'm like, okay, then I'll fix that. But it's interesting, even just like once you've gotten past the point where like you kind of have the structure down, just to kind of throw it out to friends, you kind of get like how people might respond to it. Like, you know, I had just had one of my good friends just read my manuscript that will hopefully be publishing next year. And it was interesting to see the things that she loved and the comparison she made. She was like, oh, this is, you know, found family. And it's like a really messed up retelling of Mr. and Mrs. Smith. And it, you know, even that stuff comes up. Yes, it was tired pirate and chaos himbo spouse, demon spouse. But
I'm
you know,
ready.
like,
I'm ready.
Thank you. But like, it's great because then it gives you that safe space for like, okay, what do you think people, especially once you are publishing, what do you think people will respond to, react to, and kind of, you know, have those pieces in play before it actually goes out into the wider world.
Yeah. And my only caveat is that like, if I am fortunate enough, I'm not always fortunate enough to have like multiple people, but I had probably more beta readers when I was younger. And there's always like one outlier, you know, who says, a good friend of mine, when she read an early draft of Court of Five, said, lose the first person present tense, because she didn't like it. Fair enough, right? But I knew I wasn't going to lose the first person present tense. So I just accepted that she didn't like it and that I just had to set that aside, right? And you have to also know that. You have to know where you say like, no, this isn't up for grabs. This isn't, you know, you have to know when to not, to let it go. Yeah.
It's useful data, but it's not a mandate getting feedback.
Yeah. It's yes, it's not a mandate.
Let's see, we have a question from Tracy about categories. I find a lot of fantasy and sci-fi are lumped into YA when something is published as YA versus adult. Do you as the author decide this, or does the editor or publisher do that? And do you have any thoughts about what content decides that?
I have thoughts.
Go for it.
Yeah, I have thoughts in the fact that that a majority of female science fiction and fantasy writers can write adult and will be told that they're YA by, not usually by their editors or their publishers, but it's this marketing tool, and it's something that just because you're a female author, it's just kind of assumed you write YA. When I had my pirate book go up, which is like retired pirate mother on Goodreads, it was immediately classified in YA. You know, like it's something that can be so dispiriting. I talked to a lot of other female authors where we don't even bring it up anymore because it's just it feels like there's nothing you can do about it. YA is very much, you know, it's a marketing tool, and it means different things. In the United States, it's a stronger category than say it is in the UK or in other environments, but it's meant as a marketing tool. And I think it very much, there are certain expectations. And I think when people are going in expecting certain stories, like, and listen, this is something, I'm talking very fast. People are gonna be like, oh, she has.
No. I am very clear. I am with you, Shannon.
Yeah. You know, there is overlap. But I think for female authors in general, it has become a problem, that we kind of just, oh, you don't write adult. You're a woman. You can't write adult.
I also think that I say this as someone who's been around for a while, I saw in the aughts, so that in the first decade of the 21st century, there was just this big infusion of male writers, wonderful writers, right? Great guys in the epic fantasy field, and very few women. And a lot of these women went into YA when the YA boom happened. And I think, I can't speak for them, right? I can't say they did it for this reason or that reason, but one reason I think was that they could just get published there. I know at least one case of someone who tried to publish a book in so-called adult genre, SF and F, and couldn't, and then turned around and that same book got published in YA, and the third book of that trilogy became a New York Times bestseller. And because she couldn't get it into, and one of the fascinating things, I think YA as a marketing category has plateaued a little bit in the last year or two. You know, it's like, it was so big. And so, and then now it's kind of like, you know, whatever. And now I'm watching writers who've been labeled Y, or who have been writing that specifically have been writing YA. Now they're all writing adult SF books, right? Oh, I'm publishing my adult SF. So now it's just interesting to watch these shifts go back and forth. But I want to reiterate what you said was that women, I do think women writing SF and F will more likely be said. It will be said of them, oh, this is juvenile, this is YA. And YA means not important, not deep, too much character driven, too girly, whatever girly means, right? Something to be dismissed. And I think it's a problem, but I think it's a endemic problem that's been going on in different ways for decades, unfortunately, in the field. So all we can do is just keep writing and then pushing, push back. And succeeding, right?
That's true.
Right?
Certainly.
Yeah.
With that in mind, we have a question from Tracy who says, how do you personally approach writing respectfully for inclusion and diversity?
I'll give my short answer, which is that I don't, this is a complicated question because we live in a complicated and very imperfect world. And I try to write for reality, which means to deal with all the things in the world that happen, all the people, all the layers in which human beings live with each other. I try to write the stories that I can tell, which are my attempts for myself to understand the world. I try not to talk over people, and I do my research, more research than I think I need to do, because I'm going to make mistakes. But mostly I just try to write as much realism into my books as possible, and as well as I can. And then and research includes talking to people, reading things. Shan?
Yeah, I think, this is one of those things I don't think I can answer in just like 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Because when the conversation comes up, to be quite honest, I don't like the word diversity, because the word diversity immediately implicitly centers whiteness. It centers a certain perspective that is normal, and diversity is, those Black and brown people there, or those marginalized communities over there. So I sometimes, when I hear like, oh, how do you add diversity? Like you said about reality, and like, I don't know. I write books that have, are actual indicative of reality and history. I work mostly in historical fantasy inspired by the medieval Islamic world, and I make that world look like how that world would have looked like. I think, people will be like, oh, they'll be like, I put you in the diversity bingo box. I don't know what to say when I hear that. I think it's just, you're writing it. And again, you do a lot by not being an asshole and doing your research and listening to people, and just kind of like, I think people want rules when there really aren't firm rules on this. There are certain perspectives. I don't think you should necessarily you can look at the world, read a newspaper, look at what is selling. Like, if are you the person, if you're not Syrian, should you maybe be writing that book that's going to be about the Syrian refugee issue? No, that falls into the you're probably an asshole category. I think it's just really being, like listening to your intentions and your heart, and kind of going back and thinking, just constantly, is this my story? Is this not my story? What aspects are resonating me? What parts can I tell? Doing your research, for what I work on, especially because it does take place in our world. Like, again, I probably completely over research. And
no, you don't. You don't.
No, you don't understand. This is a psychotic bookshelf.
No. I do understand.
Yeah,
you don't.
That's true.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't think there are really any rules. It's just about being respectful and taking a seat when it's necessary, and just really, going on the idea that this is a process. And I think there's a lot, if you're writing about these communities, are you an ally to these communities? Is this, sometimes it's like, if you have to okay, I don't know anything about this group, let me read a book or hire a writer. Should you be writing about them? I think there's a lot that goes hand in hand of being respectful and kind of examining yourself and your motivations a lot.
Yeah, it's a tough, like, as you said, it's a tough question to answer in a, in a 1 minute, a 2 minute thing, because it's so much more complicated. But I also understand that people are trying to do their best.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know. I don't have a good answer, except that there aren't rules.
Yeah.
But yeah, there is. But thank you for asking.
We only have a minute or so left. So I know you probably get asked this a lot, but I think people like hearing, is there anything that you're working on right now that you can tell us about, either of you?
Well, I'm waiting for Mr. and Mrs. Smith in the Indian Ocean among the Muslim pirate repair. So yeah. That's that. I have finished and revised the second Sun book, the second space opera. It's massive. It's really long, but oh well, that's life, right? Not as long as Ken Liu's book, which I'm reading the arc of. This is the fourth of his Dandelion Dynasty. Look at this thing. Look at this. Look at this. Look, people, I can write short.
I feel like a long novel is your reward for writing Servant Mage. You did it. You were up to the challenge.
Yeah.
And
yeah. And then I'm actually just starting to revise now a follow-up novella, which is actually a short novel. It's not a novella. It crept over for Tor.com. It's completely different. It's my first contemporary fantasy. Yeah, and it's set in the modern, it starts in the modern world, starts in Hawaii actually, but it has portals and dragons and one very pissed off mom.
I am intrigued. I am always here for the pissed off moms.
And it's funny. Yeah. I'm always here for the pissed off mom. And
yes.
I love her. Anyway.
I have one in my next book. I mean, I should first be like, yes, I have The River of Silver, which is the collection of Dave Abad's stories coming out in March. But then hopefully next winter will be the first book in my new trilogy, which I have been calling The Adventures of Amina Asarafi. I don't know if my publisher will stick with that. I figure I'll just repeat it repeatedly until that has to be it, which is an intentional play on The Adventures of Ibn Battuta, because I kind of pitched it as Sinbad the Sailor meets Pirates of the Caribbean meets Ocean's 11, which is sort of this forcibly retired group of smugglers and pirates has to get back together for one big score. And it was sort of my love letter to a lot of the wonder literature and the travel literature, but from the perspective of the people who had to actually cart Ibn Battuta around.
I'm so ready.
I love writing older characters. Don't get me wrong, I liked my David Abad young, idealistic people, but it's been a joy to write a mother, to write people who are just tired and have 8 needs, and aren't worried about the coming of age struggles. So it's been very enjoyable to kind of sink into a very different world with shorter books.
Yeah, which I'm so impressed that, well, I mean, I guess because you're doing a trilogy, I guess that will work, that you could do it. I'm so impressed you did 400 words. Yeah, this one is 50,000 words. Okay. But I mean, there could be more. There could be more. But it's a complete story. It's a complete story. And she's older. And she just has no fucks left to give. None. And this is not a spoiler because it happens on the first page, and her adult son is missing. So.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So
I'm into it.
I just, yeah.
Well, I think it would be hard to be more excited about both of these books. I can't wait to see everything that you guys have coming out in the near future. Again, if anyone here has not yet purchased Servant Mage, please do so. It's such a fun and wonderful book, wonderful main character, and an exciting new world. So grab it, read it. It's out tomorrow. And in the meantime, what a wonderful conversation this has been. Thank you so much, Shan and Kate. It's been an absolute joy to listen to both of you.
Thank you so much, Alex, for hosting us.
Yes, thank you for having us. Thank you for inviting me, and everybody should go pick up Servant Mage tomorrow, mostly because I'm very intrigued to see the discussions around it, because there was a lot about it that I just loved, and I it was something I couldn't bring up because it would be a spoiler. So
Plus,
Yes.
I have
Time
to
to spoil
say,
season
I
ended.
want to say that it has an incredibly fabulous cover by Tommy Arnold that that captures the theme. It absolutely captures the theme of the book.
Beautiful.
So it's a beautiful cover. And I love cover art. So
Yeah, it's really lovely. Well, thank you both. And thank you everybody who is here tonight. I hope you have a lovely evening, day, or morning, depending on where you are. And I hope that we see you again soon. Bye, everybody.
thank you so much.